Hello and welcome to Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardway. The world that we live in is getting worse. Here in Ukraine, all it takes to remind us of the precarity of the world order is the semi-nightly Russian missile attack. The explosions are a good alarm for that. But this is not simply a problem in Ukraine. It is around the world. There's a deterioration of things. Right now, there have been more wars since any time since World War II. This is compounded by environmental disasters, disease, economic failures, and the dissolution of the post-World War II liberal order. The world that you grew up in will no longer exist. This may seem alarmist. This may seem like too much to say. But let's be serious here. We all noticed it. And you're not wrong. Some of you are right for the wrong reasons. We'll get to that later in the series. But things are not good. This is what has been referred to as the Polycrisis. Crises throughout the world, all connected through shared reasons, having shared results that all interact with each other in pretty negative ways. Now, of course, each and every one of these crises have their own reasons. Here at Ukraine Without Hype, we are very careful about this. We like to be sure that we dig into the exact reasons why an event is occurring and not rely on overgeneralizations and stereotypes. But the fact remains that these all do interact. There is one global community, and an injury to one is an injury to all. In this series from Ukraine Without Hype, we'll be looking into what that polycrisis is. Right now, I'm looking at a couple of episodes. I'll probably expand on that later. At the collapse of the international world order, what is growing up in its aftermath, as well as some of the smaller causes that lead to things getting worse, from the state of the media and information, technology, and the bizarre political holes that we are always digging ourselves into. If you'd like to support this endeavor, as well as the rest of Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters. Your support is really what makes this all possible. Let's face it, especially in Ukraine where the economy has issues. With this first episode, I really want to go into what it all leads to. And in fact, this is kind of the genesis of where this idea came from. Is a couple episodes back, I mentioned that I wanted to cover the various wars that are going on throughout the world, kind of out of that nagging feeling that you get as a journalist of, why aren't more people talking about this? Why isn't there more coverage of this or that thing? And in Ukraine, you feel it so much about topics such as Kherson and the daily Russian attacks that they go through, of the kidnapped children. And you really have to think to yourself, why can't I talk about that? I did want to go over what all those wars were so that we weren't missing out on anything, that we could draw them all together into some of the common things that cause them. But really, one of the things with journalists is that we like to cover our own beat. I talk about Ukraine. I talk about things going on around Ukraine. I tend not to trust journalists who go too far afield of what they actually know. So I do feel a little bit of guilt of doing this just to air it all out. But nonetheless, I am trying to make a point. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is part of a growing trend of more war, and not only more war, but the complete inability of the international community, as it is called, to address war. There are many things that our European and American partners could have done to scare Russia off from attacking in the first place. There was a sense of complacency in the world, a sense that Russia could be lived with, that Russia, their threats were just, the inane rambling of old men nostalgic for the Soviet past, and not direct threats of future imperial aggression. We have lived for years in something of an eternal present, where nothing happens, everything stays the same, and the problems of the world are something that happens somewhere else. They're not in our immediate area of concern. But that's not how the world works. Just because people are dying over there and not over here does not mean it doesn't affect you. Really, everything affects you. The whole world is one big system, and that by ignoring problems that don't exist in your immediate field of view, you make those problems worse and you invite more problems in the future until they eventually get to you. And that is what the West has collectively done for a very long time. And so with this series on the polycrisis, I want to begin with where these problems lead. We'll talk about disinformation. Yes, disinformation often leads to people suffering. We'll talk about environmental disasters. Environmental disasters are increasingly leading to war. So before we go over the causes, I want to cover the effects. So in this episode, we'll be covering all these wars. This will not be an exhaustive list. Right now, there are 59 conflicts happening in the world. Most of these are smaller, and I really can't cover all of them, even with my expansive definitions here. Many of these are civil wars, simmering low-scale conflicts where maybe 100 people die a year, and that's 100 tragedies a year in places like southern Thailand, various insurgencies in India. But even for my big project here, that's just too much. So what are the major wars happening around the world? And like many things that happen in the news, unfortunately, President Donald Trump has given me a good framework of how to begin talking about this. In that, Donald Trump has claimed that he has ended 7 wars. 7. It took a bit of digging to find out what exactly he means by these 7. What has he claimed credit for? And so for our list of wars, our explanation for the global wars, I think we'll just start out with these ones that Trump has really claimed credit for ending, and explanations for why that's completely not true. It's a lie. And so the other different thing here is that this is on video. Usually this is just an audio podcast. So if you like this format, patreon.com/Ukraine without hype, YouTube, Twitter, all the things. But I'm going to keep the editing of this quite simple, just talking into the camera with a little map in one of these 2 corners. Haven't decided which one yet. Most of you watch YouTube. One is just running as you're doing something else in the world. Third screen viewing, third screen viewing, sure. And so we'll begin. So what are these wars that Trump has claimed that he has solved? Let's see. Starting off, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Now, we recently did an episode about this supposed peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan and how it's not really a peace process. A little bit of background here if you're not familiar with Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a war in which the primarily Armenian region of what was officially part of Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh, sought to be independent from Azerbaijan. Soviet border drawing things, they did not feel as though it was appropriate in the first place. A lot of people died, a lot of people were displaced on both sides. This was not a one-sided conflict by any means. Fast forward to the year 2020, and Azerbaijan, unlike in the early 90s, is now far stronger than Armenia. This war that they do to overtake the Nagorno-Karabakh region, they take most of what the Armenians are holding, but left behind a much smaller Republic of Artsakh that was surrounded, mostly cut off, and supported by Russian peacekeepers, as good that they were worth. Until in 2023, they came in to finish the job. The Armenian population of Artsakh was mass displaced to the Republic of Armenia. There's a handful of Armenians left in Artsakh, not that many, elderly mainly, while Azerbaijan also occupied several areas within the Republic of Armenia proper, not Artsakh, but Armenia itself. And ever since then, Azerbaijan has essentially been threatening to do more of it. They have been threatening to take what they call West Azerbaijan. They have been threatening to... Okay, this is not the Armenia-Azerbaijan episode. I had to hold it back on some detailed, very threatening statements about how various parts of Armenia belong to Azerbaijan, and they will take them how they want to hold the Zangezur corridor. It's this area that runs from the main part of Azerbaijan to an enclave that's separated from it by Armenia, and then onward to Turkey. They want full control of that route there. And this whole time, Armenia has kind of been living under the gun of yet another war until very recently there was a peace conference. At this peace conference, Azerbaijan promised that they would not threaten Armenia's territorial integrity in exchange for this corridor that I mentioned, but with one little catch. This was not actually a peace agreement. It was more of an agreement to have an agreement. It was the outline of what an agreement would be, but the Azerbaijan government has made it quite clear that this is not yet a peace treaty. For that, they want Armenia to amend its constitution to remove references to its Declaration of Independence, because that Declaration of Independence has reference to Nagorno-Karabakh being a part of Armenia. As I've described in this much longer episode about Armenia, that would go very badly. And so this idea of a peace treaty, it's still very much in the wind. It is capitulation. Armenia lost a war, and these are the terms that are being enforced upon it. And it seems like it could take a while for even those terms to be agreed to. So, did Trump end that war? No, he did not. Next up, we have India-Pakistan. A couple months back, India and Pakistan had yet another round of fighting over the status of the area of Kashmir when the Brits left South Asia and divided their Indian colonies in two. It left Pakistan and India, but these were kind of artificial in a way, and there are several areas that could have gone either way, Kashmir being one of them. And in the end of the historic geographical region of Kashmir, it is now being held in various parts by India, Pakistan, and also China. So that's another conflict that often comes up between India and China, but people don't tend to die, so we're not going to cover that. And ever since then, there has been an ongoing insurgency by Muslim Kashmiris to leave India, essentially, while India itself has become increasingly authoritarian in the region. It ended a lot of the area's special status, and what led to some of these more recent conflicts is that they got rid of the policy where people from other parts of India were not allowed to move to Kashmir. You had to be a native Kashmiri. Now that's over, and people from other areas of India are moving into Kashmir, upsetting the status quo. In a reaction to this, the terror group known as the Resistance Front attacked a town named Felgam, which is a resort area. And that means that there was a very chilling video of this attack of somebody on a gondola, like you would take when you're going skiing, looking down on this massacre taking place. This massacre where 26 people died and 20 more were injured. All on video, very gruesome stuff. India blamed Pakistan for this attack, leading to a couple days of cross-border firing, of aircraft shooting each other down. From a technology perspective, there are a lot of commentary of how this war was carried out, but it eventually ended with a ceasefire and negotiations. Did Trump handle these negotiations? No, both countries have said they handled these negotiations pretty directly among themselves. So no, Trump didn't end that one either. Next up, we have Cambodia and Thailand. And in another case of colonial borders always kind of being a little bit weird, this goes back to some ambiguities of where the border was between the Kingdom of Siam and the French Indochinese colonies back in the 1800s. And ever since the independence of Cambodia, there's always been conflict about where this border should be. In the wake of first the Vietnam War and then the Cambodian War with Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge being driven out by Vietnam and that whole historical saga, the border area between Thailand and Cambodia was quite hot. People did die. There was mining. Lots of things that we are often not always told about in school, in my experience. But quite recently, however, there have been international mechanisms that can help decide these things. Cambodia took Thailand to court in the ICJ to settle this conflict of where this border is supposed to be way back in the 1960s. And in at least one of these areas, a Hindu temple called, I'm sorry, I have no experience with Cambodian words, but Preah Vihear? Excuse me. I am going outside my comfort zone for this. Though we did study this quite a lot in university. I studied political science, international relations, and when we covered the things that an international court could do, this was one of the main examples. There could be conflict resolution through international mechanisms, but that's for a later episode. And in this recent clash, I can say this is another one where there's a lot to say for both sides. And I typically hate that sentence, but in this case, there are things to say for both sides. And that is, it seemed as though, from my perspective, from my reading of the news, that it was Thailand making more bold moves into the disputed territories, setting up barbed wire, that kind of thing, when, yes, this kind of is, according to international law, supposed to be Cambodian territory. But Cambodia reacted unwisely. Cambodia, by far the weaker of these two countries, seemed to have been getting ready for a large-scale assault into Thai territory. There was trading of missile attacks. Most of these wars, a lot of them consists firstly of trading of missile attacks. I understand how that looks like. But Cambodia and Thailand did reach an agreement to end the fighting. But again, like in the case of India and Pakistan, the Thai and Cambodian governments seem to mostly say that it was their own doing more than anything else. Next, we have the war that happened between Rwanda and Congo. And I feel like this might be the one that people know the least about in the audience, at least thus far. And for this story, we begin with the Rwanda genocide. Rough sentence to say, but such is the news. During the Rwanda genocide, if you're not completely familiar with it, members of the Hutu ethnic, not exactly ethnic, it's complicated, identity group, we'll go with, launched a large-scale genocide with machetes of the Tutsi population. But moderate Hutus were also targeted, but ultimately the side of the Tutsi won. The Tutsi rebel army led by Paul Kagame drove out the genocidal government of Rwanda at the time, and the remnants of the genocidal militias and army were driven into the Congo, where the Rwandans pursued them. Pursuing this Hutu fascist army into the Congo led to the first and then second Congo Wars, beginning in the mid-90s, that killed a lot of people. 5 million people ultimately died, not only combat deaths, but also from malnutrition, disease, and all the other things that accompany war. It was one of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century, a century that had a lot of deadly conflicts. And it's really not talked about so much. Understudied, certainly. Unfortunately, in the West, we don't really pay much attention to Africa. People live there. A lot of things happen there completely out. And my own bias is that when I'm talking about African countries here, these are certainly the conflicts that I know the least about. So that's my own weakness. Not a uncommon one. But ever since the Second Congo War ended, there never stopped being fighting. These various militia groups that not only the Rwandans, not only the Hutu and Tutsi, nothing like that. It led to a much larger conflict with a lot more militias, a lot more grievances to go around. When a war enters a country from outside of it, it tends to inflame tensions that may already exist. See the Lebanese Civil War, for example. But there has been an especial increase in conflict between the Congo and a Rwandan back militia known as M23. There have been various phases in this conflict. Sometimes M23 did worse. Sometimes M23 did better. In this case, this year in January, they were stunningly successful. From what I understood, it was completely unexpected even. They're able to take the city of Goma, so it wasn't just rebels out in the countryside and just beware of when you're in the bush. These were cities where people live, and a lot of people live. And in one of the more gruesome episodes of this war, the M23 rebels were able to open a prison, and the male prisoners got out, went to the female side of that prison, and it was bad. It was really bad. Look it up if you really need to. I think you can kind of guess. The fighting eventually ended on June 27th with a peace agreement that Marco Rubio was there for, so you could kind of count that as a peace that Trump won, but the fighting began almost immediately thereafter. The peace treaty did not hold. And in fact, as we're filming this, there are ongoing battles happening in the Congo right now that could turn into something much worse. The war didn't end. It's still going. So no, that's another one that peace was not accomplished in. Next, we have some ones that really don't make any sense of why anyone would consider it even a war, let alone a war that ended. And we'll start with Kosovo, Serbia. And of course, ever since the Kosovar War, there had been a lot of tensions between Kosovo and Serbia. Especially in these last few years, there have been an attempt by some of the ethnic Serb population of Kosovo to assert some kind of autonomy between Serb majority municipalities. There was another conflict that came up when Serbians were required to have entry and exit documents to get between Kosovo and Serbia. This is not something that Serbia approved of, because to them, Kosovo is still a part of Serbia, and therefore requiring entry documents would be an admission that it's not part of their sovereign territory, which they cannot do. And at the height of some of these protests, the one about the Serb municipalities, there was a buildup of the Serb military on the border with Kosovo, and they're kind of threatening to invade. It was all really a show. Kosovo has a very large NATO military installation. It's not exactly a place that can be invaded without NATO immediately shutting it down. There was no war there to end. So did Trump end it? You end something that never started? Who knows? And the even more ridiculous one is the conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia. Now, you may immediately notice that those two countries don't border each other. So what kind of war were they having? Well, the Ethiopians were building a dam on the Blue Nile, a river that becomes part of the Nile, obviously very important to Egypt. So the water resources of the Nile are something that Egypt cares very much about. So they protested the building of this dam by Ethiopia, but no one was shooting at each other. It was a diplomatic disagreement. It's unclear what sometimes things are just said in the American media that they just accept. And this is a very confusing one. I don't know. That's kind of the whole point of this series, I suppose. The world is dumb and stupid and bad. And this is an example of that. There was no war between Egypt and Ethiopia, and Trump lied. He just lied. And this last of the 7, that'll bridge to the rest of the episode, it is the war between Israel and Iran this summer as a part of the much larger Israeli conflict. There's not a great name for it because Israel's at war with everyone at the same time, apparently. There was an exchange of missiles several times, actually, between Iran and Israel, and until eventually ending 12 days later in June. The Israelis claimed that they were targeting the Iranian nuclear program, and apparently they destroy a lot of sites associated with that program, but their ambitions to knock it out completely were not fulfilled. The Iranian nuclear program still exists. There are still underground facilities that were safe from the missile attacks. The Israelis also took out a lot of the Iranian military infrastructure, and now Iran is pretty militarily crippled. So it certainly wasn't a loss for Israel, but not as much of a win as they were claiming, which is kind of a running theme recently. And did Trump end this war? No. The Iranians and Israelis really seem to have kind of a conflict. Maybe they could have geared something up, but Israel was taking a lot of damage from these missiles that they would rather not have. Iran obviously was very, very, very heavily damaged by this war, so just kind of ended, I hate to say naturally, but logically, yeah. And also America was a co-belligerent in this war. I don't know if you consider no longer bombing someone to mean making peace with them. Sure. If that's the claim, then sure. So of these 7 wars, did Trump end any of them? No, not a single one. But let's double down into a bit more seriousness. That was a very convenient framing device. And it's a framing device that unfortunately we'll have to return to in future episodes because Orange Man bad is the cause of a lot of the crises within the Polycrisis. So we'll return to that. But where are the other conflicts happening in the world? And I guess the best way to start that is to expand on what's going on in Israel. Now, a lot of our listeners are aware that I do have a pretty deep connection to Israel. I lived there, I was educated there, and I had friends there. I'm certainly not disinterested. I even had an acquaintance die on October 7th. But that doesn't mean that I approve of the actions of the Israeli government. So let's get into the other wars that Israel was involved in other than with Iran. And the main one is, of course, Gaza. And as we are talking right now, Israel is launching a ground offensive on Gaza City, where, once again, this is supposed to be the last big offensive that will finally take out Hamas leadership and free the hostages, unlike Rafah, which was the exact same thing that they said that turned out not to be true. And we just have to be straight up here. The goals of the Israeli government are not to free the hostages. They're not behaving in a way that one would behave in order to free hostages. They're kind of following the Russian school of hostage rescue right now. The stated goals are release the hostages, which all you have to do is see how the Israeli government treats the hostage families to see that that's obviously not true. They don't care. And to remove Hamas from power. These are 2 mutually exclusive goals. Someone isn't going to give up hostages if you say you're going to kill them anyway. That's not how a hostage works. But what is the goal of the Israelis here? I don't know if they know themselves, but it is my policy to take the more extreme versions of stated goals and treat them as the real goals. This is what I learned from dealing with Russia. And with that, it's the depopulation of Gaza, either through directly killing people or by making it simply uninhabitable. Gaza, right now, is practically uninhabitable. There is so much destruction that what are the people left there supposed to do? The obvious thing is to want to leave. And that is an option that Israel would very much like them to take, so they have less Palestinians to deal with in Gaza. And the language surrounding this, let's say, sounds familiar. And no, Ben Gvir and Smotrich are not 2 random crazies. They voice Israeli policy. They make Israeli policy. They execute Israeli policy. They have the blessings of Netanyahu and statements from other parts of the military command and on the ground agree with them. Stop discounting them. Beyond Gaza, there was also the war in Lebanon. Immediately after October 7th, Hezbollah, the Shia militant group there connected to Iran and was started as an extension of the Iranian Islamic Revolution during the Lebanese civil war and currently controls, dicey statement, until recently largely controlled South Lebanon as well as parts of Beirut and the Bekaa Valley. Israel launched an invasion to take out Hezbollah sites within South Lebanon, along with a bombing campaign on much of the rest of the country as well. They were able to get soldiers up to the Litani River. However, the fighting, it seems, was much more intense than what was expected, because the Israelis were claiming that they were going to reoccupy South Lebanon, which they don't. They just don't. That's a thing they said they wanted to do, and now they're not doing it. Obviously, the plans changed, though Hezbollah is heavily bloodied. But the terms of the peace agreement there were that they would be disarmed, that the Lebanese government would finally really end the Lebanese civil war by disbanding the last of the militias, and that hasn't happened yet, and it does not seem as though the Lebanese state has the capacity to do it. In the West Bank, still within the, well, it's a good word for the whole of the territory, but in the West Bank, there's also been a severe crackdown. This crackdown is actually ongoing for much before October 7th, but there has also been a very heavy military presence, especially in the city of Jenin, as well as this strip of land in between Jerusalem and this one settlement known as Ma'ale Adamim. It is the main connector between the north and south parts of the West Bank, because once you get further, it becomes desert and down into the Jordan Valley, which is much harder to have infrastructure in. So this territory is quite important to the viability of any future Palestinian state, wherever that may be. And Israel is trying to take more direct control of that with a series of construction, which requires the displacement of the largely Bedouin population living within that territory. And finally, with Syria, lots of wars. With Syria, the end of the Syrian civil war, the deposing Bashar al-Assad, the murderer, the genocidal monster, Bashar al-Assad, may his name be cursed and blotted out. It did not fully end conflict in Syria. I did not think that it would. Even when we did our episode about the end of the Syrian civil war, I said outright that I did not picture that ethnic conflict would disappear right away. And, well, it certainly has continued. On the Mediterranean coast, there had been ongoing conflicts between the new Syrian government and elements of the outgoing Syrian government, as well as the random Alawis who were accused of being a part of the former government. So there were massacres on the coast. Though there was an effort, anyway, to legally go after the people who committed that. So it's not wholly on the current Syrian government. They're doing something. Not enough. But the Israelis are more interested in the very south of Syria, where they share a border. Now, ever since the 1967 war, Israel has been occupying the part of Syria known as the Golan Heights, and has in fact fully annexed the Golan Heights, a thing they had not done with either the West Bank or Gaza. So as far as Israel is concerned, the Golan Heights are just Israel, while the West Bank and Gaza are not. So there is that distinction. But immediately after the end of the civil war, Israel decided to create a buffer zone in southern Syria, and then that buffer zone needed its own buffer zone until they were demanding a demilitarized zone that took up the entirety of everything to the south of Damascus, as well as supporting Druze militia. Druze are one of the many ethnic groups. The mountainous area in the Levantine region between Israel, Lebanon, and Syria is quite heavily populated with smaller ethnic and religious groups. The Druze are one of them. They branched away from Shia Islam once upon a time, but don't really consider themselves to be Muslim anymore. We don't need to get into all that. But basically, there were conflicts that took place between the Druze as well as Bedouin militias. Initially, that's important. This is how it began, not what it became, was that there were conflicts that kind of were between different drug smuggling gangs of Druze and Bedouin. Drug smuggling has been a major part of the Syrian economy, considering the sanctions and everything throughout the course of the civil war. Running drugs through the Jordanian border, even into Israel, has been a major source of income. And so there are conflicts over that. That took on political elements where a former Assad regime loyalist with the backing of Israel was initially claiming independence for the Druze in South Syria, while other members of the Druze community disagreed and were wanting to be more a part of the current Syrian government. However, because this conflict between Bedouin and Druze spiraled well out of control with massacres on both sides, now the Druze community has aligned itself much more with the anti-government side of things and with the support of Israel. And so there is this pseudo-separatist movement of the Druze in southern Syria that, by the way, is not directly connected with Israel. There is a lot of Muslim Arabs living in between Israel and Jabal Druze, so having any kind of independence there would be complicated. There are current talks going on between them right now, but it hasn't been going perfectly. That's for sure. Whose demands will be met, whose will not, it's up in the air. Moving on with Syria, though, where Israel is not related, so new segment. The Northeast Autonomous Area, sometimes known as the Kurds, colloquially, though it's not exactly the case. I've given this spiel before when talking about Syria in the past. The Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria and its military, the Syrian Democratic Forces, they have maintained quasi-independence throughout much of the Syrian civil war. And now, as the new Syrian government is trying to consolidate, right now, they're not the priority. The Druze are, but there are conflicts. There's shooting going on between the Syrian government and Northeast Syria. Where that conflict goes, I certainly hope that they'll find a peaceful solution where Northeast Syria can be incorporated into the Syrian government in a way that keeps some of its structures intact, as is their demand. But the other ethnic conflicts that are happening in Syria make that a difficult negotiation. Connected to this conflict with the Kurds in Syria, we have to look at Turkey. The PKK, these far left militant group that advocated for Kurdish rights as well as Kurdish autonomy and did a lot of terrorism to that end, has recently agreed to give up its arms. There was a ceremony where they burned some old weapons. I mean, it wasn't all of them, obviously. There's a symbolic show they were giving up on this insurgency. However, if the fighting between the various militias aligned with the Syrian government and the Kurdish ones in Syria become inflamed, then very likely the Kurdish peace process in Turkey could very easily fall apart. Yemen, there has been a very long civil war. In fact, Yemen spends a lot of time as civil war, but the Houthis, the militant group that is tied to Iran, currently holds the capital and is sometimes talked about as though they are the government of Yemen. A lot of people in Yemen would disagree with that idea. But as their conflict with Saudi Arabia ended in a ceasefire a couple of years back, quite recently, they are now in a shooting war with Israel, connected to everything else, as well as the United States, partially because the Houthis blocked off access to the Red Sea, which is very important for the global economy. So that war continues. Thankfully, we can say that the Libyan ceasefire between the various many factions of the Libyan civil war have largely held to it, though, as is the case with a lot of things here, it's a very, very tenuous peace, and there's always the threat of it starting up again. And if we look at Iran, it's not just the conflict with Israel. They have an ongoing insurgency in the Balochistan region, as well as serious protests that could also turn violent with, again, the Kurds. Moving on from the Middle East, North Africa region into South and Central Asia, we once again have to turn to Afghanistan and Pakistan, where, well, when the Taliban won the war against America. They drove the U.S. out, overthrew the Afghan government, and are now in charge of things. But it turns out whoever happens to be in charge of Afghanistan at any given time will be dealing with an insurgency. The Taliban used to be on the insurgent side of that. Now they're on the government side of that. And the insurgents are now the Islamic State Khorasan province. Khorasan being the historical region that now includes Afghanistan, as well as large parts of Central Asia and into Iran. So the Islamic State, just like the Islamic State in Syria, has a similar ideology of much more global vision of the war. They have also carried out terror attacks in Iran and Russia, but now with the Taliban fighting their own insurgency as the world goes on and on. That is just how it turns out. And just as the world continues to go in circles, Donald Trump has recently announced that he would like to go back into Afghanistan. He wants ownership of Bagram Air Base as a way to both fight ISIS-K as well as keep an eye on the Chinese nuclear program. So once again, I guess America's going back to Afghanistan. I don't know. Further into East Asia, we have the civil war in Myanmar. There was a coup in 2021 that overthrew the very short-lived democratic government. Myanmar had been ruled by a military junta for decades and had only recently had elections. And that elected government, it wasn't great. It was responsible for the genocide of the Rohingya people. But that is another one of those things where was the government responsible or was the army responsible and the government couldn't do anything about it. It's the problem that comes up a lot if you study global conflicts. When is it forethought? And when is it the consequence of not having control? Warlordism. But anyway, that government was overthrown in 2021 by the military junta. It wanted back into control, and ever since then there has been an ongoing civil war throughout the country, consisting not only of the remnants of the democratic government, but also a whole patchwork of various ethnic militias that had their own reasons to be against the central government. And though the rebels had certainly been gaining ground, especially for last year, they've been doing quite well until there has been more intervention by China, especially, and to a lesser extent Russia, though Russia can't really do anything, mainly China. So that is an ongoing and rapidly evolving conflict. But if you'd like to talk to a group that has connections in both Ukraine and Myanmar, you can go to our friends at Yellow Peril Tactical. So shout out to Yellow Peril Tactical. Now moving on to Africa, which is, I have to admit, my weakest area. I do not know enough about the conflicts in Africa as I should. I am not alone in this. The news does not talk about the African continent nearly as much as they should. I already talked about the Congo because that was one that Trump was claiming, and you barely saw anything about that if you're just watching, consuming American news on it. So I will be going through some of these conflicts, but quite frankly, I am not by any means an expert on these. But to begin with, we'll start with the kind of combined conflict that's going on in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. They undergo a lot of the same problems and are attempting a lot of the same solutions. We kind of treat them as a singular war, and a lot of people do. The Sahel War, in this region, the Sahara, the Sahel, a lot of commonalities. And in that 2022 to 2023, they all underwent military coups. The reasons for these coups are largely the same. One, they were upset with continued French influence. The governments that had previously been in place were very deferential to France, and which had a lot of economic and political and social consequences that they did not like. But one of the biggest things that the French were doing wrong was that they were losing this war against the Islamic State. The Islamic State in the Sahel Again, similar to the Islamic State in Syria, similar to the Islamic State Khorasan. It's a not very connected global movement, but similar enough to know that you know what you're getting out of them. And the French military was not effective in beating them. These countries were losing their wars against the Islamic State. However, they replaced France with Russia. And Russia has done the same stuff, but worse. Russia has also used its companies to exploit the natural resources in this area. And Russia has also lost the war against the Islamic State. They are making gains right now against all these countries. And it's very odd that when Burkina Faso is talked about, it is often this weird mythological status, this cult of personality that has been given to the leader of the junta there, Traore. But every time he tries to make the news about something, it's because the Islamic State has captured another village or something like that. And he needs to distract from it. The main story in these countries is the war with the Islamic State. But as is the case with a lot of ongoing wars, it inflames other ethnic tensions. And in this case, it is the Tuareg forming the Azawad movement, which Ukraine has supported because Russia supports the governments in these areas. And so Ukraine supports a rebel group in these areas without having to go into the Islamic State, which is a big problem if we had to go that far. And they did, and Ukraine did this because Wagner Group is in these countries. They are gaining a lot of the profits from these mines, and they are the major force behind the militaries of these countries. And so if Ukraine's going to hunt down the Wagner Group, which is now known as the Afrika Korps after the Nazi army, because Wagner Group are Nazis, something there, why not? In addition to that, and something I will expand with a bit more when I talk about Nigeria in a couple moments, there has been ongoing conflict between the Fulani group, largely pastoralists, herders, and the Mosi, who are mostly farmers. But before getting into Nigeria, Benin has not gone through the same military coups, but has had the same wars with the Islamic State. And finally, with Nigeria, and we're talking about West Africa anyway, these conflicts have begun to spill into Nigeria. Nigeria had begun to have something similar to the coup that happened in the other countries, of protests that were sympathetic to those coups, but they ultimately didn't go anywhere. The major conflict in Nigeria has been for many years, one with Boko Haram, an Islamist group whose name means Western education is forbidden. They have done many massacres, especially of Christians, but of course, where there's one conflict, there's usually other conflicts, and there has been other ethnic conflict in especially the Niger Delta, a conflict that has been ongoing for decades now. There was the Biafra War, which was a very complex war that had a lot of people taking sides that you would not expect. And though that ended decades ago, the underlying problems of the exploitation of the very rich Niger Delta by the central government without properly sharing it with the people who live in the Niger Delta has been an ongoing problem. A couple dozen people may die there every year. It's not a large war, but it is still an ongoing conflict. And these ethnic conflicts I mentioned, there will be something that will have to be explored more in another episode of this series because it is environmentally driven. Global climate change has meant that a lot of the arable land in Nigeria, as well as Burkina Faso and other areas, has become smaller and at more of a premium, which means there is more competition and therefore conflict over those resources. In the case of Burkina Faso, it's the Fulani and the Masi people. Similar conflicts happen within Nigeria, and they're going to happen more. Will cause more conflicts, leading to more displacement, leading to more of everything. So another episode on that. Looking to the rest of Africa, we must first look at Sudan, one of the largest wars happening right now, and one that is often used as more of a rhetorical device, unfortunately, than a place where people are actually suffering. There was a civil war that began in 2023 between the official government and the Sudanese armed forces with what's called the Rapid Response Forces, a set of slightly less regular armed groups, but nonetheless part of the Sudanese state. These are two elements of the Sudanese military who went to war with each other. Though the Rapid Response Forces are the surviving elements of the Janjaweed who carried out the Darfur genocide years ago. That is something that I think most people have heard about when it comes to Sudan, was the Darfur genocide. The Rapid Response Forces are the people who did that, and the Rapid Response Forces are the side that's backed by Russia, and so Ukraine has been involved with that in order to hunt down Wagner there as well. Small teams of people, but they exist. As of May of 2025 this year, the battle for Khartoum is over, with the Sudanese armed forces and the central government holding the city of Khartoum. But as with a lot of the conflicts, it is accompanied by, again, malnutrition, disease, refugee crisis that is very inadequately responded to. Going to Cameroon, this is another ongoing war that has been between the northwest region of Cameroon that is largely English-speaking, called Ambazonia, with the largely French-speaking central government. Both sides have been responsible for many war crimes. There have been some pressures on either side to come to some kind of peace agreement that has still been very out of reach. Ethiopia, I feel as though there was more news coverage of the Tigray War that happened in between 2020 and 2022, in which the Tigray region was in revolt against the central government of both Ethiopia and Eritrea, which is a very unpleasant country in its own right. And again, both sides of this conflict did commit various war crimes. However, the actions of the Ethiopian government have very credibly been referred to and being investigated as genocide. This was a very horrific conflict, as many other conflicts have been stated. The Tigray War itself ended in 2022. However, there is ongoing fighting in Ethiopia with other rebel movements among the Oromo and Amhara, and so the war is still ongoing. Again, I just saw news of more fighting happening. The war is still happening. There was more coverage of it happening back in 2020, 2022, because the Tigray War was so extreme, but the news ended, the fighting did not, which is a very common theme here. People get bored. Hopefully you're not bored of this episode. And the last thing to say about Africa is the ongoing conflict in Somalia, referring to a lot of various ethnic and religious factions, including Islamists, and the Islamic State is also active in Somalia, who has carried out attacks in Kenya, for example. In that conflict could be expanded upon soon, as there is an ongoing push from different countries to recognize the breakaway region of Somaliland. The Ethiopian government has opened up more communications with Somaliland for economic cooperation. Within the current Trump administration, there is actually a couple of people who are more Somaliland friendly. That's one odd thing about Washington, is that there will be these politicians who, quite surprisingly, have a strong affinity for one reason or another for various conflicts around the world that you might not fully expect. But it seems as though, oddly, there is a push for Somaliland recognition in the United States right now. You don't hear much about it, so don't expect much out of it, but maybe, who knows? And we'll wrap things up with the Americas, the last of our continents. Haiti, through much of its history, has been quite troubled. There has been a long history of various conflicts and dictators and things like that, but things have gotten pretty bad since 2020. Again, partially exacerbated by some hurricanes and climate-related issues. But beginning in 2020, various criminal groups have begun to assert themselves more, especially in the capital of Port-au-Prince. The largest among them is a gang known as G9, led by a man sometimes referred to as Barbecue, for not very wholesome reasons. And very dramatically, there was the assassination of the president of Haiti, Jovenel Moïse. Sorry, I don't know my Creole so well. In 2021. And as of now, the situation in Haiti is still very rough, with a multi-directional war going on between these various criminal groups against not only the government, but also a lot of vigilante groups that have arisen to fight against these gangs. There has been an international peacekeeping force that includes a lot of Kenyans, for example, but gangs are something harder to negotiate with. Speaking of which, heading down to Mexico, there is the cartel wars. Well, there's been continuously a lot of violence regarding the drug war there and the fighting between the various cartels and the political violence that takes place, the assassinations, the killing of groups of school kids by cartels, the killing of journalists by cartels. Though I do must say that this last year has been significantly less violent than in previous years, partially because of actions taken by the current Mexican government. Even though the violence has decreased, America was threatening to invade Mexico for a while. Everyone on the Republican ticket was promising to invade Mexico, though it seems as though the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, has largely convinced Trump not to do that. It was looking pretty imminent, pretty serious, and then it just didn't happen. And finally, with another thing that America is getting involved with, as the Venezuelan dictatorship under Maduro, the things there have gotten worse. There has been an increasing refugee crisis. And while the civil war in Colombia basically came to an end, apparently there are some places where it hasn't. And conflict continues involving both rebel groups and drug groups. And again, America wanting to step in and stop these vile drugs from coming into America has sent a naval group to Venezuelan waters and have begun shooting what they claim to be drug smuggling boats, though if they actually are, doesn't appear to always be the case, we can say. That is all the conflicts that are ongoing, at least that I'm going to talk about. This was an extensive, but certainly not exhaustive list, though I've hit the larger ones. I'll put up a little infographic right here, one of the two, of how many people have died. I'm just going to throw out the Wikipedia chart. I'm not going to get too fancy with this. I covered most of these conflicts, but why? Why are there more? The many reasons why there have been an increase in conflicts throughout the world will be the main reason we're going to be exploring this series of the Polycrisis. But a short answer is the controls that existed in the past no longer exist. If we look at the period of the Cold War, the era after World War II had markedly less state-on-state wars than the past. There still were state-on-state wars. There was 1967 war in Israel. There's a lot, but fewer. And that's what we're working with here. Trends, how things work. But the world was locked into this binary system, and the conflicts were not so much states versus states, but more so conflicts within states. Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. You get my point, though. And within this system, there would be a rebel group or a government that would align with either part of the Cold War, either the United States or the Soviet Union, or later on China. If there was a militant group that could make its case they're fighting for one of those sides, they could petition Moscow or Washington or Beijing, as the case may be, to get support, weapons, money, diplomatic support, whatever they may need, which allowed conflicts that may not have otherwise boiled over into larger wars into becoming larger wars, because there was this outside influence that wanted them to win. And if they did not have that outside supporter, they would have had different calculations of whether something was worth fighting for. And so there were a lot of these civil wars. Though I will say that this will be talked about much more when we talked about multipolarism, for example. The Cold War was not as bipolar as people make it out to be. Every country continued to have its own positions and interests and acted towards that goal, often working Moscow and Washington against each other. That said, different time, different episode. But when the Cold War came to an end, there was a new order, and now there was not that support. So a lot of the wars that had gone on in the 70s and 80s came to an end in the 90s or beforehand. because that sponsor for one of the sides wasn't there. And also the United States didn't care as much to keep supporting the side when the whole pitch that they were making was, you have to support this or the Soviets will take over. Well, there's no Soviets, so we don't have to support you anymore. So it was a severe drop-off in wars in the 90s because of that. The 90s were relatively peaceful. There are very extreme counter arguments to this that will be part of later episodes as well, that there was Yugoslavia. There was the Congo Wars that I already talked about, as well as the Rwandan genocide. Somalia. There were still horrible wars. Don't get me wrong in what I'm saying, but compared to what existed before, overall throughout the world, especially in South America, not as bad. Not as bad. And in this time, this will be the focus of the very next episode, there was this international community system that worked to prevent conflict and act when it occurred, often acting insufficiently. The Rwandan genocide did not need to happen. But there was this feeling that the international community existed to prevent conflicts, and it works sometimes. The consensus that international community exists is gone. America's moment in the sun is over, and there's nothing replacing it. So right now, if there is a conflict between two wars, who's going to stop in? Who's going to step in to stop it? America? The whole first part of this episode was about how America as a mediator is completely worthless and will just lie about what it's doing in order to take credit for things it didn't do. Interestingly enough, Russia also served this goal. If you go back to Armenia, Azerbaijan, part of the reason why the Second Karabakh War was able to happen was because Russia could not stop it from happening. Russia did have a hegemony within the former Soviet space where they acted as a guarantor. This was not a good arrangement for a lot of people. Certainly not for Ukraine. Certain. But within this hegemony, Russia saw its interests as making sure that they're the ones calling the shots. They can't do that anymore. And so with Armenia, Azerbaijan, it is partially Azerbaijan asserting itself. And as we talked about in a very recent episode, Azerbaijan is not getting along with Russia anymore. And Turkey is stepping in, asserting its own interests in the South Caucasus and many other places besides. China, not even worth talking about China in this conversation. There are no mediators. There are no people who are there to step in and cool things. The system that existed was terrible. The absence of that system is worse. But again, different episode. And also, with Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine showed that a lot of the rules that people thought existed no longer exist. According to the United Nations Charter, you're not supposed to do a war to capture and annex territory. Empire building was supposed to be over. There were still wars. But America, when it invaded Iraq, did not say it was there to annex Iraq as part of the American empire. The idea was that there would still be an Iraq that had its own sovereignty and independence, because that's what the rules were. That rule no longer exists. Russia violated it, and there has been precious little done by the international community to stop it. There is no longer a taboo against wars of annexation. There's going to be more wars of annexation. War is how you settle land disputes. We have seen the erosion of the nuclear threat go away because everyone's saying that you can't step in and stop Russia because they're going to launch nukes. And that's not how nukes work. Nukes are supposed to be defensive in nature. That's what mutually assured destruction means. There's no longer a taboo against even wanting to appeal to the international community. Again, the Iraq War, not good, but America felt that it had to make its case to the world, get some kind of approval from somebody, and even though that approval was not forthcoming, they still felt they had to go through the motions. Russia didn't even bother. And in this fracture moment, we don't know what the rules are, and all taboos have been violated, and the only thing that matters is naked force. We went over many of the largest conflicts that are existing in the world, briefly touched over why they're happening, and why we can expect more. In our next episode, We'll go over what that international system was and why it is dying. These episodes of the Polycrisis will be an ongoing series. A couple episodes have already been planned. They will not be straight through, so expect the next episode of Ukraine Without Hype to be a news episode, and these will be interspersed with both news episodes and some special topics. So don't expect this week after week, but amongst things. Again, if you'd like to support us, go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype. And until next week, Slava Ukraini.